number of books on leadership, but The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team is one of his hallmark books. And it looks at what are the obstacles that teams will have to overcome in order to be cohesive and high performing. And he starts at the bottom of the triangle. For some reason, Pat does everything in a triangle. But at the bottom of the triangle is building trust. The dysfunction is the absence of trust. And most organizations, but especially Christian organizations, presume trust. And that's really dangerous. You know, you think, well, we're Christians, so of course we trust each other. But trust is really something that you're always building or always repairing. And there's different components of trust: character, competency, vulnerability. So what's the work on a team in an ongoing daily way of building trust? That's kind of foundational. Then the next dysfunction above that is part of the reason we build trust is in order to have conflict. And the next dysfunction is the fear of conflict. And part of that basic part of his model was why I was so drawn to him. I've never really read anybody in leadership that tackled head on not only the reality of conflict, but what I would say is actually the necessity of conflict. And Pat says, if you have enough trust on a team, which doesn't take terribly long to have enough to start engaging in conflict, you want people having productive and unfiltered debate around the issues that are key to decision making in an organization. So we'll come back to that in just a minute, because that's really, it sounds like what we're here to talk about tonight. Then on top of the fear of conflict, the next dysfunction becomes the lack of commitment. And commitment really is decision making. So I don't know if you've ever been in a meeting, but I've sure been in meetings where I've left and I've thought, did we decide anything? Well, it doesn't matter. We're going to change our mind next week anyway. And dysfunctional teams will resist coming to closure and decisions. So part of the reason you have conflict is so that you do great decision making, because all the opinions are out on the table. You've had robust debate. It really moves the team towards being able to make a solid decision. Then on top of the lack of commitment is the avoidance of accountability. Even a great team, when they make a decision, becomes dysfunctional when they fail to hold each other accountable for that decision. And you can see in the model already how your ability to handle conflict is really connected to your ability to hold people accountable. They're very tied together. Accountability really is not just the boss holding people accountable, because pretty soon, no matter who that person is, if it's just one voice, you can start to tune them out. But when you have what Patrick says is one of the most powerful forces on a team, peer-to-peer accountability, when you have your peers holding you accountable, it takes leadership to a whole new level. And then the top dysfunction is the lack of results. And I think the way the lack of results shows itself, especially in a Christian organization, is something like this. Well, we worked for 6 months. We spent a lot of time and energy around this outreach event because we wanted a lot of new people to come to the church. And we were hoping to get 300 people and only 6 showed up. Well, I guess those were the 6 people that God wanted. And I feel like sometimes God's up in heaven, like, why do they keep blaming me? I gave them resources. I gave them a great mind. But we're very quick to dismiss our lack of results and spiritualize them so that we don't have to feel the pain of, was there something different we could have done? What can we learn from this? So let's drop back down to the conflict piece. And let me flesh that out a little bit, and then we'll stop for a few minutes and interact around that. And then I'll jump back in and we'll do some other stuff around conflict. I think it's really clear. Sorry, my husband's bookshelf is falling apart. In the current climate of our culture right now in our country, we have a lot of examples of people handling conflict really poorly. And we have an opportunity as Christ followers to engage in the conversation in a way that elevates it, because we have become more sophisticated and kind and truthful, and people who listen as well as pontificate in our culture. So this is a really important topic. And I don't know what the configuration of your class is, how many of you have already done ministry, how many of you have come straight out of college for this, but you won't be doing church work very long before you realize that you may have stepped into the stickiest kind of organization in the world for handling conflict poorly. I was with Patrick a number of years ago, and he was doing a talk to a room of, I think, 10,000 CEOs. The room was enormous. It was like an auditorium. And this was not a Christian organization. And Patrick, as he was going through the model, talked about what organizations do you think are the worst at conflict? And without prompting, almost in unison, the room erupted with the word churches. And I just wanted to die. Because if anything's true, it ought to be that Christian organizations are really committed to great leadership. And great leadership will necessitate you being able to handle conflict really well. So our current climate necessitates it. The call to be part of the church or God's kingdom in whatever arena that takes you, whether it's the marketplace or parachurch or church organizations. It's impossible to work with people and not have to enter into conflict. So part of what happens is the starting place is, how do you personally feel about conflict? One of the things that Patrick talks about is organizational change always presumes individual change. And I got to tell you as a consultant, what happens almost every time, no matter what kind of organization we're with, whether it's corporate, nonprofit, education, or church, by noon on the first day of a 2-day offsite, everybody on the team will have pulled my partner and I aside, my consulting partner, and told us who the problem on the team is. And I got to tell you, in 12 years, there's not been one person who has said, you're going to find this out sooner or later, but I'm the problem on the team. And it's that deep need we have to scapegoat people instead of to realize, oh man, this team is a system. And it's never just one person. It's always the whole system. So being able to look at you individually first and say, what is my view on conflict? How comfortable am I with it? How well do I do at handling it is the starting point for the organizational issue of conflict. So let me ask a question, just to be polemic for a moment. If you had a gun to your head and you had to decide, did I primarily grow up in a home that was avoiding and withdrawing when it came to conflict, or more attacking and exploding? What's the first thing that came into your mind? Because all of us grow up in a home that leans a little bit towards one or the other. And I'll have people all the time that'll say, well, I had one parent that did one, and I had another parent that did the other. Fair enough. You also have one parent that sets the tone or the culture for the family a little bit more than the other. So let me have you raise your hands. How many of you would say, I would have to say, for the most part, it was avoiding and withdrawing? Raise your hand. Okay. And how many of you would say, nope, not for me, it was attacking and exploding? 2. Okay. 3. Really interesting. When we do this discussion on a team, it's fascinating to look around the circle so that people begin to see that's our starting point. It's just simply what we grew up with, and what you grow up with puts deep ruts into your brain, positively or negatively. What's interesting is most of us, as we grow older, gravitate towards withdrawing and avoiding simply because it's easier. Not everybody, but for the most part. So understanding kind of family of origin issues around this is really important. When John and I were dating, we weren't even engaged yet. We both had jobs, and we agreed after work one night we were going to meet at my parents' house in the Los Angeles area and have dinner, and then we were going to go to a movie. And on the way to the movie, he was uncharacteristically quiet. So I just asked him, are you okay? And he said, oh, I'm fine. And I thought, oh man, I know what I mean when I say, I'm fine. I'm usually not. So I poked a little bit, and he said something obscure like, well, that just felt kind of awkward and uncomfortable. And I said, what felt awkward and uncomfortable? And he said, well, the fight. I had no idea what he was talking about. I said, do you mean that we're going to have a fight tonight? I don't understand. And he just was exasperated with me. And finally he said, no, that conversation about the flat tire at dinner at your parents' house tonight. Here's what happened. I I was working at the time as a nurse doing admin work at a large hospital in Orange County. Sit down to the table. My dad asked me, how did work go? And I said, work was great, but I came out to the parking lot, had a flat tire. What did you do? He asked me, and I said, I called the auto club, but I had to wait 45 minutes. They towed me over to 4-Day, and I got a tire. And my dad said, 4-Day? We know Jeff over at Sears. He gives us a huge discount. Next time, take it to Jeff. And my mom said, Sears? I go to Goodyear. That was the fight. And I remember thinking, uh-oh, we have a huge gap between what he felt like was a fight and what didn't even register in my mind as an awkward conversation. So true to form, he kind of, as an introvert, kept processing that experience. And 6 months later, after we were engaged, he brought that topic back up. He said, do you remember that night we were going to the movies and we were talking about the fight? And I said, oh, the fight that never happened. And he said, honestly, in the home he grew up in, he never would have even thought, if he got a flat tire, that he should do something about it. And I said, yes, I'm picking that up now. I just kind of thought that the tire fairy came and fixed everything. And then he said, if I had taken initiative to do what you did and get the tire fixed, my parents' reaction wouldn't have been to criticize where you took it. And I said, they weren't criticizing, they were just offering other options for consideration. He said, my parents would have said something like this: you are quite possibly the most remarkable person in the universe, and this story will be in our Christmas newsletter. What? And that's just the beginning of 34 almost years of figuring out this rhythm of conflict in a marriage where our family of origin issues were very, very different. Everybody has a place in conflict where they're most comfortable. For many people, it's way before conflict even shows its head. For other people, they don't get nervous until somebody pulls out a weapon, and everybody's somewhere in between on that continuum. Les and Leslie Parrott, I don't know if any of you have had a chance to read some of their stuff. Their names actually are Les and Leslie Parrott. They're Christian psychologists up at Seattle Pacific University who write predominantly about marriage, but anything you can say about a relationship can be extrapolated into an organizational principle. And I love this sentence. Listen to this. They wrote this: conflict is the only way to intimacy. Conflict is the only way to intimacy. And when I first saw that, I thought I should have that tattooed somewhere on my body. But I was old enough that I thought I would have to stretch my skin out soon to read the whole thing. So I just decided to write it down and try to remember it. But this is fascinating. So the very thing every one of us was created for and longs for, intimacy in the form of a life partner, friendship, relationship with God, coworkers, the very thing that we were created to long for, that will get us there, is the very thing we avoid at all costs. And therefore, we settle for artificial harmony and pseudo-community and a lack of transformation that is staggering because we're afraid to enter the danger zone with each other. So let me stop there for just a few minutes. And any thoughts, comments, questions, disagreements, recipes, whatever. Because it'll be a lot more fun if I'm not the only one talking.
Nancy, could you just keep talking about that a little bit more? I think that's actually fascinating, Eric, as far as conflict being the pathway to intimacy and how it's what we long for, but we avoid.
Okay. Sure.
Talk that a little bit more, because that's a very profound thought.
So let me give you an example. And I think this one stuck in my mind for two reasons. It was a consulting job that I had 3 partners in my consulting practice when we worked with Lencioni, and one was a guy named Kent, who I worked with pretty often. And Kent is one of the most non-anxious presence people you'll ever meet. And I don't know how many of you have read much about that, but there's a lot getting written on the greatest gift that a leader can give to an organization is a non-anxious presence. So what I love about that is the theological implication that the number one command in the Bible is do not be afraid. And so it's a lifelong journey as a leader to understand when I'm feeling anxious and dig to the root of it and be able to start to overcome that in ways that what I can offer other people is a non-anxious presence. So I loved working with Kent for that reason. I remembered this organization for two reasons. The first is it was in 2008, and I am such a nonlinear person. I remember the year I was married. I remember the year each of my children were born. I couldn't give you a timeline on the rest of my life if you put a gun to my head. But I remember it because it was at the beginning of the recession, and it was one of the only corporate clients we had that year that was actually making money. So they really stood out. It was a young startup. They probably grew 35% in 2008. The other reason I remember it is because the story that I'm about to tell you from the second day of the 2-day offsite was one of the most winsome examples of spiritual formation on a team that was not Christian. And when we got done with that job, I remember just aching in my heart when I left and thinking, why can't churches do this? So it was a young team. The youngest on it was a guy named Steve. He was about 28. Everybody else was in their 30s, maybe one or two people in their 40s. Really young team, very dynamic, high pressure, moving fast, very successful. So we spent the first day going over the 5 dysfunctions of a team and kind of dismantling it and doing a lot of work around correcting that. And by lunchtime on the first day, Kent and I regrouped a little bit and said in unison as we looked at each other, it's Lisa. Yeah. Both Kent and I had been pulled apart separately, and from almost everybody on the team had heard, oh, it's Lisa. Lisa is such a problem. So that gives us some indication on where the conversations need to go. So we go through the 5 dysfunctions of a team. How do you build trust? How do you engage in conflict, decision-making, accountability, results? And the second day, we spend most of the day talking about organizational clarity. How do you get clear about your mission, your vision, your values, your strategy, your goals? And then how do you integrate that organizational clarity with a healthy team dynamic? And we were in the middle of a strategic discussion, talking about their strategy and whether it made sense, whether they needed to pivot. And Lisa was talking, Lisa, the girl that was the problem on the team. And while she was talking, Steve, the youngest guy, was moving around in his chair like a volcano ready to explode. I had no idea what was going on until about a minute later when he just erupted. In his mind, he must have been stuck on the day before when we were talking about conflict and the need to be open and honest about everything on a team. And he interrupted Lisa, totally out of context, said to her, Lisa, the problem is you're a jerk and you never get your work done on time. I mean, he said it almost, that was word for word what he said. And I just froze and I thought, oh, no, that's not what we meant when we talked about doing conflict. In fact, I do remember thinking, I should get your mother's phone number because I'll bet she didn't raise you to talk like that. I just remember thinking, I don't know what to do next. And Kent, who, again, is just this non-anxious presence, he stands up very slowly, kind of unfolds his 6'5" frame, chuckles a little bit, and says, well, that's a very interesting comment. Nobody would look at him. Everybody was looking at their shoes. Everybody. And so Kent just said, is it true? Does Lisa not get her work done on time? Crickets. Then Kent took a red marker, and went to the whiteboard in the upper left-hand corner, wrote, Lisa, you're a jerk. And I'm thinking, oh, because we might forget what he just said. And then the next thing I thought was, we're so not getting paid for this job, they're going to kick us out of here. And then in the upper right-hand corner in red, he wrote, you don't get your work done on time. No idea where he's going with this. Kind of worried about him. Then he says, these are 2 completely separate issues, and with your permission, we're going to handle the one on the right first. And then we're going to go back to the very poor way in which Steve said it. That's genius. In most Christian organizations, people would flutter around Lisa like a victim and soothe her and say, oh, there, are you okay? And then they'd turn to Steve and make him the villain and the bad guy, and the issue would never get resolved or even talked about. So taking the power out of the very poor way that he said it and starting with the issue first was brilliant. Then he said, I'd like you guys to answer the question, does Lisa get her work done on time? Just like this, silence, nobody saying a word. So then Ken said, all right, Sally, we're going to start with you, and then Jeff. I just want one word answer. I want a yes or a no. I don't want a story. I don't want a caveat. I just want one word answer. And he made everybody go around in the circle in front of Lisa, and everybody except one person said she does not get her work done on time. And the person who said, oh, I think she gets her work done on time was her BFF. And I think in a very misguided understanding of what does it mean to be loyal to somebody, just felt like her job was to protect Lisa. So then, can you imagine who was ready to talk at this point? Lisa. And if you had been in the room, you would not be surprised that on her face was kind of this mix of anger and humiliation. And she was beet red and she was fighting back the tears. And she said, first of all, I cannot believe that you guys waited until we have two strangers here to bring this up. And then she said, second of all, I can tell by looking around the circle, you guys have had this conversation without me. Had it? Are you kidding me? They've been talking about her for a year. A year. And then somebody on the team, and I think a very, again, misguided attempt to be kind, said, Lisa, this is not like you. Up until about a year ago, you were one of the highest performers on the team. Is there something going on at home that we don't understand? Now, that at first blush sounds like a very kind thing to say, except that it was a year late. She let Lisa go for a year unraveling and did not ask that question earlier. And Lisa was almost yelling at this point. She said, no, there's nothing going on at home. She said, we have grown 35% in the last year. I'm the only high-level admin on the team, and everybody is handing me a third more work than you did last year, and I'm dying. And in that moment, two things happened. The first is there wasn't a leader in the room, myself included, that didn't recognize myself in her. Have you ever been over your head and not knowing what the answer is, and instead of asking for help, you just put your head down and you try to work harder? I've done that. And then the other thing that was so profound was that this was a problem that was pretty easy to solve. In fact, the CEO at this point was a little embarrassed, and he said, you know, not only have we grown 35% this year, we can easily afford a second Lisa on the team, or a Lisa that reports to Lisa. Lisa, go hire a full-time person to take care of this problem. Now, not all problems get solved that quick, but because of the nature of that problem, it was pretty easy to solve. But we weren't done yet, because that just solved the right-hand side. Now, Kent brought us back to the left-hand side of the flip chart, the way Steve said it. Imagine, though, how much power do you think had gone out of the initial horrific reaction everybody had? 70%. People were not as on fire angry at Steve, even though he still needed to correct it. It was like, okay, conflict is just energy, and it's going to go somewhere. And it goes down deep into your soul, and sometimes it erupts at the most inopportune moments. So Kent said to Steve, let's talk about ways you could have said that better. And Steve, 28-year-old kid, stood up, told my 6'5" partner, go ahead and sit down, Kent. I'll take it from here. Amazing. Looked at Lisa, and he said, first of all, I owe you an apology. I should never have said it that way. What I wish I would have said, Lisa, is this. I find myself increasingly frustrated every week when I come to this team meeting and everybody else on the team has their work done, but you don't. Now, if you can't hear a sentence like that, you don't belong on a leadership team. That's beautifully stated. And Steve admitted right away, I just said it so poorly because I kept it in for such a long time. Conflict is energy. Conflict is going to go somewhere. And where it most often goes when we lack courage is we create the meetings after the meetings. And Lisa says something in the meeting that makes you mad, and you don't say anything because you want to be nice, which means you just don't want to say anything when she's in the room. And as soon as you leave the meeting, you go find somebody else that agrees with you that Lisa didn't do the right thing. And that conversation is one of the most delicious and delightful experiences in the world, which is why we do it. And we throw that person under the bus so that we feel satisfied that we're right and we're a little superior, but we would never have those conversations with Lisa. And it's just not biblical. It's not redemptive. And then the other thing I loved about what Kent did, and this may be one of my favorite takeaways, is if you're going to get better at conflict, if your team's going to get better, which is just another word for community, you have to give people permission to do it poorly in order to do it well. So Steve did it really badly. But if you make him the villain and you gang up and you shame him, what you've told him is, when you tried, it wasn't good enough and it wasn't perfect. So don't ever try again because it was awful. It's a little bit like when a toddler starts to walk. They're doing everything wrong. They're wobbly. They're lifting their knees up too high. They keep falling down. You watch that 2 or 3 times and your response really ought to be, you need to stop doing this. You're not very good at it. You're not getting better quickly. We're going to outsource walking because you just can't handle it. No more walking. It's so bad. But instead, we don't do that, do we? We do just the opposite. We get down on their eye level. We look them in the eye and we clap for them and we say, come here. Come on, let's try it again. Let's try it again. But we don't give each other that same grace to forgive. I think one of the most profoundly spiritually formative things about conflict on a team is it gives us a place to practice forgiveness. It gives us a place to ask, how easily offended am I? And I got to say, I think Christians ought to be the most difficult people to offend in the world. And we are clearly not. I think it gives us an opportunity to forgive and not hold grudges and to refuse to enter into those delicious conversations about what Lisa was like in the meeting after the meeting. And I got to tell you, when we came back a month later, because we worked with that team for almost a year every month, there was a palpable difference on their team from having that breakthrough and that conflict. It changed things. It changed the way they communicated. It changed. I love Grenny in his book, Crucial Conversations. You can tell the health of a relationship and the health of the organization by the lag time between an issue comes into your mind and you bring it up. That's pretty profound. So I think conflict is not only necessary for healthy organizations and healthy communities, I think it's deeply spiritually formative. So, all right, I'm going to stop talking for a while, and I'd love interaction, thoughts, questions, disagreements, but no raising. No raising.
I have a question on the, you had said the greatest gift for a team is a non-anxious leader. Can you share a little bit, I know that I asked you a question asking you to talk more, but can you share a little bit more about how you define what a non-anxious leader looks like?
Yeah. So everybody in an organization needs to be able to look at somebody who, no matter what's happening, is giving off the message, we're going to be okay. We're going to be okay. We're going to figure this out. Doesn't mean they have to have the answers, but that is communicating to everybody. Take a breath. You don't need to be afraid because I'm not afraid. Let's get together and solve this problem, have the conversation, make the decision. And you don't have to be the top leader in an organization to bring the non-anxious presence. Every leader, and again, please hear me. This is not something you work on and then you're over. It's a lifelong journey of understanding what triggers my anxiety. How do I behave when I'm anxious? Because everybody behaves differently. Some people look obviously anxious. Other people that are high control get angry and dominant. And that doesn't look anxious, but that is just simply another form of anxiety. How do you communicate to people verbally, bodily, eye contact wise? I'm calm. I'm not rattled. I'm going to listen. We're going to figure this out. And by far, that is one of the greatest gifts that you can give to an organization. Yeah. And, you know, probably when I describe that, probably somebody popped into your head. So I would go take them out for coffee or pick up the phone and say, tell me how you got there. And tell me what you're continuing to do, because fear will always rear its ugly head. And it disguises itself in lots of different forms. So sometimes you don't even know you're anxious. Part of why I love assessments like Myers-Briggs and DISC and Strength Finders and Enneagram is a personal favorite. And the Enneagram thought for the day that you get over email, oh my goodness, will that go after your deepest anxieties? And the more courage you have to admit, yep, these are my issues, the further you can go on that journey to be a non-anxious presence. Yeah.
In dealing with conflict.
That's not a joke. Yep.
Matthew 18 is kind of the model, which is what everybody would be familiar with in church to grow that person and to somebody. When you are talking about teams and organizations, regardless of the context, and you have somebody who is habitually dishonest and manipulative, you know, where do you go with that when you bring it to the group? I mean, is there literally a time to just bail and say, man, this is an absolute poisonous environment? Where do you go with all that? Somebody who's, I mean, I really think of manipulation and habitual dishonesty are the words that come to my mind.
Yeah.
Confronting somebody with honest conflict.
Yeah. So Matthew 18 is primarily about when somebody has offended you. So when that is a direct offense to you, absolutely, there should be a time where you sit down one-on-one, or if you don't feel like that person will receive it, bring somebody with you. When that person's dishonesty and manipulation affects the whole team, the issue should come up at the team level. It's not shaming. It's handling the issue where the issue has its impact. And you're absolutely right. If over time there's a recalcitrant spirit, there's a lack of change with coaching, you know, with perhaps performance goals and evaluations, with peer-to-peer accountability. When somebody simply will continue in the vein of being manipulative and deceitful and dishonest, that can create quickly a toxic environment on a team. And it is amazing, taking one person off the team that falls into that category will make a huge difference on the whole team. You have to give people a chance. You can't jump to conclusions. All of us have a pet issue. Like for some people, it might be, boy, if somebody's dishonest and manipulative, I'm done. Other people are like, you know, I can handle that for a while. What I don't like is spinning or arrogance. So you have to be careful that you give it enough time of coaching and feedback. But you're absolutely right. Over a period of time, if that doesn't change, it will affect the entire team. And those are really hard situations.
I have a question because you mentioned the word shaming a couple of times. And right now in our culture, there's a big shift happening with that being an issue. We're supposed to be careful not to shame people. And if you look at the Bible, it's written in an honor and shame culture. So I struggle with that concept altogether. But how do we do these kind of things carefully so that we don't shame people if we're not supposed to? And shaming sometimes okay. Like the shame of letting my parents down kept me from stealing from someone else, you know? So I don't see shaming as a terrible thing, but it seems to be labeled as a terrible thing in our culture now. So how does that come into play?
You know, I think words are so interesting, aren't they? And I think shame carries the connotation that your very identity as a person is at risk, that you are not worthy. And I think that's where most people would understand shame as being toxic when it goes that direction, that sort of differentiates shame from guilt. And that guilt is that belief that I have done something that I oughtn't to have done that possibly will harm another person. And you're right, the Bible is full of times when God puts people's guilt in front of them and says, you need to look at this. So I think the difference between guilt and shame needs to be understood. And I think Brene Brown, I think, has written beautifully on this. I don't think you want to shame people because there's almost an implicit message in shame that you are beyond help and that who you are as a person is not valid. That's a step too far because there's nobody that God would say that about. But guilt and accountability and conflict, it's all the courage to admit, not just say we're broken, but actually be broken. And to be able to put each other's broken. Here's how I experienced what you said in the meeting. It felt like you were spinning and you were trying to represent your area as much better than it actually is. And I start to lose trust in who you are when you talk like that. Could we have a conversation about that? I think that's a very appropriate conversation. And you can't do leadership without holding people accountable. And some people just in accountability will go to shame, not because of anything you've done perhaps, but because of how they experience it. And helping people understand the difference between shame and guilt sometimes if somebody feels the weight too heavy, like you're saying I'm a worthless person. Actually, I'm not saying that at all. In fact, that's where vulnerability helps, to be able to say, here's some things I do wrong as a leader. We're not talking about me right now, but we can later. Right now we're talking about you, and this issue is really important and we need to talk about it. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
Nancy, I'm still going back with the conflict, the Sarah again, and conflict being the pathway to intimacy. So in some ways, you almost have to define what intimacy is, which would be some type of combination of reality and acceptance and forgiveness. And that it's a proven thing. It's not a positional thing. So in other words, you're saying you kind of have to go through. We can always be polite to each other, but that's not intimacy. We can get along with each other, but that's not intimacy.
Yeah.
So it's almost like you need to almost beg for that conflict moment to define the relationship.
I agree with that, Eric. I really do.
Just thinking this through, but so it's, in other words, rather than avoiding it when coming into a new team or a new relationship, pray for the time that it happens so that you can either receive forgiveness or grant forgiveness or or lean into understanding and live, the things that breed intimacy. It's almost like, I think your point there that we avoid the thing that brings intimacy, but that's what we want.
Yeah,
so we structure our lives not to have it, though.
Yep, exactly right. Yeah, and there's a kind of vulnerability. Probably all of us can think about a time when a boss held us accountable and we didn't like what we were hearing from them, but they were right. And that when we look in the rearview mirror, it really changed who we were. Those are defining moments, if you will, in our lives. But then it's so funny how we try to avoid having those with other people, even though they were very beneficial to us. I mean, here's what's interesting when you go through the Gospels. This is interesting not only in a leadership context, but deeply in a spiritual formation context for yourself as an individual, but also as a leader of, in churches we're trying to do spiritual formation. If you go through the Gospels, I would posit that Jesus used conflict and difficult conversations more than prayer and encouragement put together to spiritually form people. Now you start coming up with a tally list of how many times you use difficult conversations and conflict to spiritually form yourself or other people versus times when you just say kind and nice and sweet things. And I think most of us would say we're on the wrong path.
Nancy, I have a question. In your experience, as we're getting more and more into the internet age where we're doing things like over the internet and Skype, how are you seeing conflict being managed? Because I think for millennials, it's a lot easier to write the stuff out over Skype or email that you're bothering me. But then when forced to personally do it, we retreat and we hide behind this false, self.
I think you said it really well. Yeah, I think you said it really well. There's just not a better way to engage in conflict than face to face. And sometimes it's not possible, but most of them use it as I'm getting feedback. Are you guys hearing that? Love it. It becomes protective. We can throw bombs out. We can say things that we would never say face to face with somebody over the internet, or we can avoid. But there's really no substitute for face to face. It's like you can have sex over the internet too, but it does not compare to having it in person. So, just trying to throw something out there to make you move around. Or
other questions for Nancy? Nancy, you skipped over trust is the base of the pyramid. What kind of base of trust can there be to have those crucial conversations? Is there
that's a good question.
Crucial conversation on day one, or do you need to kind of observe a little bit more to kind of
I think day one is probably not the best day to have a crucial conversation or a difficult conversation or conflict. Stephen Covey wrote a book a handful of years ago called The Speed of Trust. And it stood out to me because trust seems to be such this touchy-feely, ethereal thing that's hard to pin down. You know, a lot of consultants will build trust supposedly by blindfolding teams and having them fall into each other's arms or doing a rock climbing wall. That's not really about building trust that's going to translate into teamwork. Lencioni talks about trust is based on three things: character, competency, and vulnerability. And in Covey's book, he makes a case that trust doesn't take all that long to build, to have enough trust to then have these difficult conversations or to make decisions. Trust is something you're always building or repairing. But in his book, The Speed of Trust, he says that when you have high trust on a team, here's what happens. You make higher quality decisions quicker, which result in increased profitability in however you measure that in your organization, whether it's money or disciples or whatever. So he builds a case for the need for trust. In order to trust you and you to trust me, we have to trust each other's character. And what will happen in that situation, so the example I used just a minute ago, if you sit in a meeting with somebody and every time they're telling you about their area, they're spinning, like they're just making it sound way better than you know it is. That's a character issue. And we're all capable of doing that. And so somebody on the team ought to say, Nancy, I love you. I love working with you. But I'd love to hear for a minute what's not working in your area. Or when you say that Jeff doubled his ministry, I actually stopped by there last week and they might have had 2 or 3 more people, but no, I'm not trusting what you're telling me. And maybe I'm wrong. So maybe we need to have this conversation so you can say, oh, that was the wrong room. We moved rooms. We had to move rooms because we grew. Oh my gosh, I didn't know that. But your character is not something. Here's what I see all the time in Christian organizations. If somebody says anything that seems to be questioning somebody else's character, it's this mock, feigned offense. Oh my gosh, I can't believe you would attack my character. Is my voice doing weird things? Okay.
You sound good now. You sound fine.
Okay. You know, your character is up for reflection on every day you go to work, every day you're on a team. Again, this goes back to Christians should not be so easily offended. So your character. We worked with a church a couple of years ago, big church. On the second day, the executive pastor was just driving me crazy. And I just said, dude, you suck the oxygen out of the room. Every time you come into a room, you just suck the oxygen out of it. He's a bigger than life character, but everything's about him. Every story comes back to him. Every conversation is about him. And I was only with the team for 2 days and I was exhausted. I don't know how everybody else on the team did it. And as soon as I said that, of course, everybody on the team said, yeah, that's the way we experience you too. Well, why did you wait for me to get there to say it before you could? So character was an issue. Competency. You've got to be able to trust that somebody knows how to do their job. You guys don't know me, but if you were working for a church or a nonprofit and you hired me to be your chief financial officer, you shouldn't trust me because I hate a spreadsheet. I don't do numbers. I don't like budget. I'm not good at it. It's not because in that case you wouldn't not trust me because of my character, because my competency isn't fit for the job. And somebody's competency, they might need resources, they might need to take a class, they might need to be mentored, might be in the wrong position. But then the last thing that really accelerates trust is vulnerability. Lencioni says people would walk through fire to follow a vulnerable leader. And when you have a leader that says, I don't know the answer, what do you think? I messed up, I dropped the ball. Those are really powerful words because here's what happens on a team when a leader says that. Up until then, and most of you have probably worked for a leader like this, who thinks they're Moses, and they went up on a mountain alone and they got the vision from God, and they came back and they made all the rest of us executors of their vision. Well, sign me up to go do something else. Like, I want to participate. I want to collaborate. Moses went up the mountain to get the 10 Commandments, not to get the vision for the church. When you have a leader that says, I don't have all the answers, some of you are going to say, oh, I know how to do that. And all of a sudden, you're not just on the team, you're necessary to the team. When a leader makes space around the table for people who are smarter than they are and more gifted than they are, that, my friends, is a secure and a great leader. And that's one of the ways you build trust. You give work away, you give stuff away to people that are going to do it differently than you, better than you, and you don't worry about how does that make you look. So you got to have enough trust to be able to have conflict, but the irony and the paradox is that sometimes by having conflict and working through it well, you actually build trust. So they're very related to each other. Yeah.
So it's a little bit like in Brene Brown's talk, she says, the thing we fear most is vulnerability, but when she's talking about the TED audience, she said, but the speakers you admire most are those who have been most vulnerable.
That's exactly right.
The same thing. It's this paradox that if we can understand in the moment the paradox, we might act.
Yep. And the vulnerability makes you think, I'm not alone. I'm not the only one that struggles with this. I've had those thoughts and feelings and fears too. And it goes back to the non-anxious presence. So when you sit down with a great leader and you say, I don't know how to figure this out, they don't react in horror. They say, yeah, sure, I've had stuff I haven't known. Let's figure out how to do this together.
For a lot of the people here, they're thinking of conflict with maybe their senior pastor, maybe the person they report to. What is it like, Nancy? How do you do that leading up, or how do you do that confronting up? Is that even possible?
Yeah, it's possible. It's hard. It's hard for sure. Couple of introductory comments that I think are helpful is, I have something I would love to talk to you about, but I'm kind of nervous and I'm not sure how to approach it with you. Are you open to having that conversation with me? It's just a great way. I mean, I'd be so curious. Like, I wonder what they want to talk about. And then I also think when you're going to have a conversation with anybody, but especially when you're leading up, I think rather than making statements, do you know you're creating a toxic culture around here in this organization? Well, that may be a step too far. It's a little arrogant. Maybe to ask questions and make observations. Why? I noticed in the meeting when you spoke to Eric, you used this tone and those words. I'm wondering why you did that. Observations. It seemed to me like when you spoke to Eric, he kind of shut down. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that because it kind of stuck with me and I'm a little concerned about that interaction and what happened. Yeah. I think doing conflict leading up is probably one of the hardest things to do. So you need to get lots of practice on peer-to-peer dealing with conflict and people that volunteer up to you or report up to you. But I think starting it off with a caveat and a question or an observation is a good way to start. And then just bring a humble spirit to it. Leadership's hard. It's really hard work. And it's really easy to sit back and armchair quarterback and criticize what somebody else is doing without any kind of understanding of all of the other pressures that they have going on. And most people, not everybody, they're doing the best they can. I hate that. Well, everybody's just doing the best they can. No, not everybody's doing the best they can. I often don't do the best I can. But sometimes people are doing the best they can. And so I would go in with a very humble spirit.
Okay, now just keep going.
Okay. So let me give you a couple of examples of times when, one time when I got held accountable, and then one time when I held somebody else accountable and tried to create peer-to-peer accountability on my team. So one time when I got held accountable, we had, John and I were on staff and back in Chicago area with Willow Creek for 9 years. And the first year that we went there, I mostly stayed at home, got the kids settled in school, and did a little bit of speaking. And then it was at the end of the first year that I came on staff part-time. But during that first year, I got asked to preach Mother's Day, to which I rolled my eyes and said, that lacks imagination, but sure, I'll take Mother's Day. And then the second one was Labor Day weekend, which again is a throw off because nobody's going to be in church on Labor Day. So let's give it to the new kid. But I'm so passionate about faith and work. I loved doing that talk. And then I did a third and a fourth one. And, you know, at Willow, I used to joke that if you sneezed, you got feedback. I mean, it was a little overkill sometimes, but it was unlike many churches I had been a part of before, that people coached you before you spoke. And then after you spoke, you got a number of people who were really gifted at feedback, giving you that so you could grow and develop. So my first 4 or 5 sermons, I got coaching from Bill ahead of time and from John and other people, and I got feedback. My 4th or 5th sermon, I found out our senior pastor was not going to be in town that weekend. And honestly, it just kind of felt like a little bit of a relief, like, great, finally I get to do a sermon when, you know, he's not there. So when he got back in town, he listened to the sermon, called me up to his office, and I went bouncing up there with my notebook and got my little pen out to take notes, and knew he was going to coach me like he had before. And he said, so tell me what you were thinking in the structure of your talk. So I started bopping off, and he stopped me and he said, actually, that was a rhetorical question. What the hell were you thinking? It was so random and not structured and chaotic. Here's what I think you did. I think those first 4 or 5 talks, you worked really, really hard and you put good talks together. And I think with this one, you got a little cocky and you relaxed a little too much and you felt like, I got this. And I remember I felt like Lisa with Steve. I sat there like fighting back the tears, and I don't cry easily, just fighting back the tears. And so angry inside, I thought, who do you think you are? And the Holy Spirit said, he be your boss. That's who he is. He's your boss. Oh, that's right. So I left the meeting awkwardly with very little resolution. And again, that's another piece that's hard and necessary in conflict. Sometimes those first conversations, you have to leave them undone in yourself and in the other person. And then you have to let the Holy Spirit do what only the Holy Spirit can do with time and space. And then you have to revisit and come back together. That's really, really hard. And it took me 2 weeks to sit with that embarrassing conversation and be able to go back and say, I hate to admit it, but you were right. And I'm sorry. And I just won't do that again. I look back on my development as a teacher, and that was a pivotal point. That was no matter what, you take this seriously. You do the work. At the time I got held accountable, and it was horrible. I mean, I don't want to go through that. I was embarrassed. I was angry. I didn't want to tell anybody what had happened. I wasn't sure I agreed with him. It was a lot. It was 2 weeks of miserable, and then always in the back of my mind. And then of course, for the next 2 weeks, everybody in the church, that sermon was so good. We loved it. And I'm like, really? Did you really? Because here's the feedback I'm getting. And as soon as I said that, they'd be like, well, yeah, it was a little rambly compared to your other ones. it's just like we don't tell each other the truth. And then fast forward a couple years later, one of the ministries, the last ministry that I led before we left was 5 years. We had started a postmodern ministry. It was one of the first to go there. A young man named Dieter Zander had started it. Gen X, really cutting edge. Dieter was a terrific leader. After a couple years, ended up having to leave the church, and I took over. And all I can tell you is, for a postmodern Gen X church, I'm guessing they were not hoping to get a middle-aged mom to be their next leader. And so literally for the first 9 months, they were Christian rude to me, which is that smiley face. But like, so I went to, Harley Davidson does a leadership conference for churches. It's fascinating. I don't know if we still do it, but it's fascinating. And one of the days we were there, the guy was describing a phrase that he came up with called malicious compliance. And then he said, this is what malicious compliance looks like. Sure, I'd love to do that. I'll get right on that. That's a terrific idea. I'd love to do that. And the whole room just erupted because we've all done it. We've all done it. And so for 9 months, I'm going to work every day on a team that does not want me there. And I'm looking for ways to build trust and to have conflict and get breakthroughs. It was hard work and miserable and embarrassing, and I self-doubted almost every other day. And then I don't have time to go, but a number of things happened that began to shift it. And another year went by, and we were planning a retreat. So we were in Chicago, so Wisconsin was the best we could do. And we were going to do a weekend retreat, Friday night, Saturday, Sunday. And we'd been planning it for 6 months. And the week of the retreat, hundreds of 20-somethings are going up on this retreat. We sit in a circle outside to talk through the flow and the design of the retreat one final time. And I find out that our director of operations has not done 5/8 of what he said he did. You talk about deceit and manipulation. He had been spinning and presenting for 6 months in the meetings. He hadn't done, there wasn't a registration team, there wasn't registration. He hadn't gotten all the rooms right. There weren't meeting rooms set. There were no free. I mean, it was one of those surreal experiences where you're listening and you're thinking, I can't possibly be hearing what I'm hearing. And so I listened, and at the end, my team was silent. And they were all young. And I remember thinking, I don't think I can do this on my own if I don't have my team helping me, that peer-to-peer accountability. So I said to, his name was David, I said, David, wow, the retreat's 4 days away. I don't know what to do with what you just told us. So here's what I need you to do. I need you to take half an hour and go take a walk. Come back in 30 minutes. I need to talk to the rest of the team. I was making this up as I went along, just making it up in the moment. And he left. They're dead silent. And I just said, how do you guys feel about what just happened? Nobody would say anything. And I'm thinking, what do I say next to get their attention? I got to get them mad with me. I don't know if that's the right thing to do, but that's what it felt like I needed to do. And so I finally said, each one of you has done all your work, right? Yeah. It's Monday. You're thinking Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday night, you get to go home every night after work, right? Wrong. If what David said is true, every one of us is going to be working tonight, Tuesday night, Wednesday night, and Thursday night to who knows how late, because we have to get this retreat done. Now all of a sudden they were mad. And then David came back. And I said, David, I hate to do this, but you're going to have to listen to everybody on the team tell you how they're processing what you just told them. And again, it's the difference between guilt and shame. He really did this. And every single one of them went around in a circle and said, David, I don't know how, this is going to take some time to rebuild trust. Like, some of my people on my team have great discernment and nobody picked it up. And they said, we're so frustrated. We've been working so hard to get our areas done, and now we will cover your areas. And then I was proud of them, every single one of them, when they were able to express their frustration to David. Every single one of them, without prompting from me, said, but we've got your back, we're going to get this done, and we're going to process this after the retreat at a deeper level, because something's going on that we need to know about with you. This is disturbing at a deep level. There's something going on inside you, David, that we want to be brothers and sisters with you around. We'll get this done, but man, are we upset with you. and that, holding him accountable with the power of the whole team and not just one person. And I've had many conversations with David since then, and he would absolutely point to that moment as pivotal, not just for his leadership, but at a much deeper level for some of the shame he was dealing with deep inside, some of the addictive behavior, some of the avoidance when things got hard, some of the hiding that was just part of his struggle and his journey. Yeah.
Yes, I just got a couple minutes to go, but I was listening to a couple of podcasts on different CEOs. I heard two contrasting views. One, even PayPal would say that when they hire somebody, they realize they made a wrong hire. They give them a minimum of 4 months salary and dismiss them. There's no development, no reason.
Yeah.
For your time here, here's 4 months salary or 6 months salary, goodbye. And other people take it as it's the people development. They're in the people development business at work. And what can you talk about? There's something good about cutting free with people. Okay, I made the error of hiring this person. We just need to get rid of him as soon as possible, compensate him. Versus work as a spiritual, as a developmental place, as a CEO of an organization that really has a big swath in the Bay Area. Small staff, but I mean, how do you think about this thing?
I like the parameters you just gave. I don't know I couldn't hear what company you said, but I know Zappos does that also. I'm not sure if you said Zappos, but within 4 months, they'll give you a certain amount of severance package if you will leave and just it's not a cultural fit. So I think it's one of my favorite words in leadership is the word tension. It's not an either or, but you have to live between the tension of those teams. Both of those things are really good. To let somebody make a decision for themselves. You've experienced our culture for 4 months. You know what it's like to work here. If you want to self-eliminate, we want to help you do that. We want to expedite that process. That's not a bad thing. On the other hand, it's also a really good thing. I tend to be I love to develop people. I tend to lean that direction. But here's a parameter I would give you. If somebody's not able to be developed to where the organization needs them to be within 3 to 6 months, you need to let them go. Not self-select, but you need to let them go. Because after 3 to 6 months, what's clear is they're not able to be where you need them to be right now. They might be someday, and their potential is exciting, but they're not what the organization needs right now. And, I've run into that even recently where it's been, I didn't get hired for that. Yes, but the organization has evolved and I need you to scale and I need you to stretch and build capacity and I'll help you. I'll get you resources. I'll get you training. Not interested. All I want to do is what I got hired for. And I worked with that for 3 to 6 months. Once I recognized it took me a while to recognize that was the issue. And then to work with that person for 3 to 6 months and then finally say, we can't do this anymore. This is not working for the organization. You're a great person. I enjoy you, who you are. You're great at this and you're great at this, but you won't stretch and grow. And so I need to let you go. And I would say for everybody I've ever had to let go, I've probably waited 3 to 6 months too long. And I think I'd rather be able to say I waited 3 to 6 months too long than I pulled the trigger too quickly. But if you wait longer than 3 to 6 months, that is so dysfunctional. I mean, the organization is a person itself, and you have to care about the organization and the functions of the organization. And if somebody doesn't fit, there are other places for them to go where they can experience the joy of fitting. That's a good thing.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Thinking about an organization as a person that needs to be considered, and you never sacrifice another person for a dysfunction or a person that wasn't developing.
That's right. That's right.
Let's give it up for Nance. Let's Nance great.
Thanks for having me.
And all the prayer chimp team praying for you. It's been great.
Well, and you guys need to know what Eric won't tell you is the organization I'm working with now. Eric was just pivotal in setting the foundation, both around the vision and around the strategic anchors that we still operate out of today. And he's a boatload of fun to work with. So, yeah.
Thanks so much, Dan.
Thanks, Eric. Good night, you guys. Bye.
Bye. Well, was that awesome or not?